We're going to start with the earliest stuff and then continue to go to the later stuff. So the quiz has one that's on like either the South or the movement West. Stimulus set, you have one stimulus set that's on something major politically that happened during that time. You have one stimulus set on progressivism and then one stimulus set on labor. So that's kind of what all those are going to be about. Okay? So we're going to go through really quickly all these different ones. So we're going to start by talking about the movement West, and it appears that the only one that I'm seeing is the Indian Wars and the Dawes Act. So the Indian Wars, remember, this is going to be caused by people who are those land-hungry white settlers, right? Remember the Homestead Act, you get 160 acres for free, you move west. Railroads begin to move west. All these people, as they move west, want better resources. Who has those resources in that land are the Native Americans. So what happens is that as the tensions rise between that land, they begin to have massive fighting. So the Indian Wars is the fighting because of that land settlement over in the west. Now, what happens is that in the end of all of this, you have a couple of big things happen. So really what you need to know for the Indian Wars is you need to know the cause, which is the movement west, the land settlers movement west, things like that. And then you need to know the effects, which nobody put the effects of here, but I will talk about it. Major effects are going to be, one is the Dawes Act. Okay? Dawes Act is very important. It does a couple of things. The first thing that it does is it changes the reservation system. Reservations that still exist are majorly downsized and made extremely small. And then most of the time, though, they encourage people to actually move away from the reservations by giving them land off the reservations. The major effects of the Dawes Act is, one, is going to be massive reduction in Native American land. Two is going to be the movement of Native Americans out of reservations. What that in turn causes is a loss of tribal identity, loss of identity in the culture. It's most of the reason why most Native Americans do not live on the reservations is because they've moved out. And then one of the big ones is that assimilation. So remember when we did the Indian boarding school thing? So remember, assimilation is the idea that you should be put into the white culture. They're going to teach you how to learn or to speak English, how to write. They're going to ask you to, instead of doing your tribal things, you're going to do all things that are similar to the white American culture. And it's basically attempting to change your culture. Any questions about this section? Okay. All right. So from there, when we talk about the movements, let's go south first. So, things that you need to know about the South. The new South is going to be the industrial South. Because they don't rely on slave labor anymore, you now have to find a new way to be able to make a lot of money. In this case, that new way that they're going to make a lot of money is through industrialization. Some people wrote about that in their essay. They didn't do the best job, so let me just emphasize creation of factories. They basically want to be able to get the wealth that the North has always had. The problem is it's still going to be agricultural, so it did not become completely the new South. One other thing, too, is this lost cause theory, and that's an important one. Lost cause theory is the idea that slavery was always justified. Slavery was a good thing. It's the idea that the South is still chivalrous. It's the idea that kind of like the Southern Belle. So if you guys remember Gone with the Wind, how she's this like plantation kind of thing. Same reason why if you go into the South right now, a lot of families continue to own these plantation houses and have plantation parties because it's the idea that there was nothing wrong with this slavery. So it really did justify slavery and made it seem like the South was fine, even after the Civil War stated otherwise. Questions about the South? One more thing I would emphasize, by the way, is don't forget those lynchings that we talked about in the NAACP. So if you guys remember, we talked about how lynchings were that mob mentality, where basically they would go and take people away, and remember that's what the nooses and things like that we talked about. So don't forget that those lynchings exist as well, and they're going to be especially prevalent in the Deep South, where slavery was the most rooted. Yeah?
Why is it called the lost cause?
The idea of the lost cause is this kind of this idea of this dreamy kind of thing where we had this idea previously that has been lost because of somebody else. So it's kind of like this hidden dream and this mentality. So like if you imagine, for example, let's pretend that you are dating somebody in this high school. And you guys go off and graduate. And about 10, 15 years later, find out that that person ended up becoming like one of the wealthiest singers in the world, and you could have been that person's special someone, and you could have been a millionaire. This is from a long time ago, but if you ever heard the song Avril Lavigne's Skater Boy, that's what that song's about, is because it's all about this guy that she dated. Okay, I'll just remind you if you don't know. It's about this guy that she dated in high school, and that guy was a skater boy, and she was like, whatever, you're useless. Ends up becoming a famous rock star, and that's the song that ends up making her a rock star, so it worked out. That's this idea, though, that when she's in that song, and she's thinking about that, what could have been, that's kind of this idea of this mentality of like, I could have been rich, and I could have been that, and you daydream about what life would have been like if you had gone with him. That's what this lost cause is about. It's people who still have this idea that everything that happened previously is very well justified, it is honorable, and you daydream about a day when you can go back to that time because it was so honorable and chivalrous. Lost cause, by the way, still exists in much of the South. My mom grew up in Texas, and she was taught that the cause of the Civil War was Northern aggression to the South. And she was also taught that the Civil War technically never ended because they never said that slavery was stopped, and it was just a ceasefire and not an actual end to the war. And that's what my mom was taught in the South. And she was taught that everything that the South did was 100%, and the South won the Civil War. And a lot of schools still teach that in their textbooks.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, was there any major effects of the lost cause, or was it just a mentality?
I would say discrimination against African Americans. It's part of the reason Jim Crow still exists, because Jim Crow is an extension of still being able to discriminate even though you don't have slavery. Okay, one more, which is a really, really important one, is Plessy v. Ferguson. So Plessy v. Ferguson, very important Supreme Court case. You guys remember the railroad cars? Goes to the north, or wants to go to a place in the north. He's told he can't, even though he has enough money to be in that railroad car. He sues. The important thing about Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. The idea that you can have separate facilities, but as long as you're giving them the same product or goods, such as a water fountain, a park, a school, it can be completely different from each other, but as long as you're given it, it's constitutional. Plessy v. Ferguson legalizes segregation in the United States. And because of that, Plessy v. Ferguson has a massive skyrocketing in laws that discriminate against African Americans in the Jim Crow era. Questions about those? Okay, moving further west is when we go into the Populist Party. Now, in theory, fingers crossed, you at least know something because we did like a whole activity on it. Okay, so hopefully you at least remember that. So if you guys remember, contextualization of the Populist Party. Why did it happen? Economic panics begin to massively increase. Corporations, monopolies, trusts begin to massively increase and have control over the economy. The economy begins to plummet. Who's most affected by that is the farmers, right? Because it's cheap sources of labor. They begin to lose all of their homes. Their good prices begin to plummet. They can't make enough money and they lose their homes and their farms. On the opposite side, corporations begin to control everything. Vanderbilt begins to control all of the western railroads. He can control the shipping prices. People lose money by shipping goods. And people feel like they need a way out. The Populist Party is the idea, a couple things. First off, much more government regulation on the trusts and the monopolies. Making sure that they're kept in check and aren't going to destroy you as a farmer. Two, they advocate for more silver in the economy. That's the free silver movement. If you add more money into the economy and throw money at it, people can pay off their debts more because they can now be paid. The last thing is the one that we really emphasize is the gold standard. They want to be able to replace the gold standard with what? Silver. Okay? Replace silver with gold because silver was more prominent in the United States. It was easier to get. It would help miners in the United States, and we wouldn't have to import gold from other countries. Okay? Now, the leader of the Populist Party is William Jennings Bryan. He's the lion in The Wizard of Oz. Right? So William Jennings Bryan is going to be the speech, the orator, the one that's going to convince you based on his words. Now, he becomes really successful and almost wins the presidential party because he's such a good speaker. And we'll have him talk about him again in the 1920s. He does this cross the gold speech, which basically combines religion with this idea of the gold standard and the silver standard. Is this idea that if we stay on the gold standard and we stay the way our economy is right now, we're just crucifying ourselves in America. We have to be able to find a solution because our economy is going to plummet. Unfortunately, once William Jennings Bryan loses the presidential run in 1900 or 1898, what happens is that this populist party begins to go down because they've lost a major presidential election. Similar to the Tea Party back in 2008, they were really successful. Somebody runs for president, they lose, it begins to go down. Similar with socialism in the United States. Questions about populism? Okay. He's really excited over there. Okay. Strikes. I'm going to talk about general labor unions because that's more going to be the focus rather than just strikes. So, labor unions, the cause is going to be those robber barons, right? People are going to have poor working conditions, long working hours. People who are going to basically say, if you get cut at work, you're fired, or you have to pay this back because you didn't do it right. It's just going to be those really, really bad working conditions. So first you have the creation of labor unions. Labor unions are going to attempt to advocate for better rights. So these are things such as the IWW, that's the International Industrial Workers of the World. Okay, that's the Wobblies. They're the one. Well, a lot of these labor unions, the ones that's the most important is the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor were the most impactful. They were also in the most strikes, the most successful strikes. So if you see Knights of Labor, that usually means it's some sort of a big strike that's on there. All the labor unions get created in an attempt to be able to better the United States, whether it be better working hours, better education, better factory conditions, get rid of child labor. In terms of the strikes are going to be the most likely ones other than Knights of Labor that you will see terms. Pullman strike, do you guys remember that political cartoon of the things squishing each other? So that is where the Pullman strike comes in. So if you see that, just think, oh, this is a labor union question. Okay? Other ones are the Homestead strike. What industrialist was the Homestead strike? Carnegie Steel, right? That was the Henry Clay Frick, the guy at Jonestown, remember? Or Jonestown, excuse me. So that's the Homestead strike. Haymarket Square riot. What happens at the square after everything's done? Bomb blows up. People get fear of this anarchy and different things like that. The other one that we mentioned on your paper was the Great Railroad Strike. All you got to know about that one is that it was kind of the first major strike that kind of starts all the other movements. One more thing that you have to remember too is socialism. Remember Eugene Debs? Is that a lot of workers advocate for socialism because it means that there's no poverty and everybody is the same. So that's the most likely political party that comes out of the labor union movement. And that still consistent until today. So like Bernie Sanders, that socialism aspect still comes from the idea of labor unions. Okay. All right. Last two really quickly. Okay. The first one is going to be the Muckrakers. So Muckrakers is super important, by the way. Remember Muckrakers, if you remember that political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt and he has the rake in his hand and he's raking through all the muck. Okay. That is a muckraker. So you guys read The Jungle as your homework assignment. That is an example of this muckraker idea. So basically it's journalists who are going to rake through the muck and they're going to expose the truth of all the bad things that are going on. So basically what happens is that these are examples of Ida Tarbell's History of Standard Oil Company, The Jungle, How the Other Half Lives. All these journalism things to be able to improve things. Jungle's probably the most famous out of all of them, as well as Jacob Riis's. Over here, first off, this was from last year, so I apologize that it was on the Quizlet. That wasn't intentional. Wilson will not be on this test or this quiz. Roosevelt will, and if you know what we've talked about with Roosevelt, you'll know that he, at least for right now, is the environmental stuff you need to know about him. You need to know about him, the bully pulpit as well, that we talked about before. Remember, that's where he does big speeches and things like that to improve legislation. And then later on, we'll talk about one more thing with him. And Taft will be talked about today after the quiz. Okay? So you don't need to know Taft for this quiz because he'll be on the possible test. And Roosevelt, you know, environmental movement, bully pulpit, that's what you need to know for this quiz. Everything else we'll learn right after the quiz. Okay, so that's all I have. Any additional questions? Yeah?
Can you explain what a political machine?
Yeah, so a political machine, remember those are going to be in big cities like New York or big cities like Chicago. And what a political machine does is that they basically, it's like the spoil system when we're voting. If you vote for me, I will do this for you. Or if I pay you $3,000 and I get to become an important person in politics, I'll make sure to do whatever you say. It's basically just bribery all around. And this helps the immigrants because the immigrants come in and they vote for the political machines and they vote them in. And then the political machines help out the immigrants in the lower class. But basically what it creates is your entire government system in both Chicago and New York are 100% corrupt. It's all people who've been paid off, all people who you have voted for, so they told you, I promise you I'll do this if you vote for me, things like that. So, like, that's Tammany Hall boss tweet. Any more questions? Okay, so that's it. If you have any individual questions, come ask me.